From the age of 6, you were radicalized to believe violent jihad is an obligation on every Muslim.
A form of Islam known as Salafism or Wahhabism. I was taught Britain is the enemy of Muslims. One day we are all going to rise up and fight jihad against the non-Muslims.
When the 9/11 attacks took place, that was celebrated.
I remember my mother saying, the non-Muslims have been killing us, now we're killing them. I was an extremist as a child, but at the same time I was gay.
What were you told?
You throw them off the roof and then stone them to death. I was looking for solutions.
You wanted to potentially be part of a terror attack in London.
The plan was to build an IED and remotely detonate it. They believe that if you die committing an act of terror, you go straight to heaven.
And this is still going on within mosques in the UK.
If anyone criticized Islam, Islamophobic or racist, and they would shut it down.
Sohail Ahmed, it is such a pleasure to have you on Outspoken. As you know, I have been trying to interview you for years now, and it just never worked out, did it, with timing? But I think your story is so critical when we look at what the UK is currently facing in terms of Islamic extremism. So I want people to hear your story. And I really want to be able to discuss it in depth before we look at the wider context of what's going on in the UK. So I think what people will be fascinated to know, Sohail, because I certainly was, is that you were born in the UK, British born. You have Pakistani and Kashmiri heritage. But from the age of 6, you were radicalized to believe, despite being British born, that the UK is the enemy, that violent jihad is an obligation on every Muslim. And this was something that was pushed by your immediate family, by your educators, by your friends. And it got to a point where you were very close to undertaking a lone wolf attack, an Islamic terrorist attack on London. And you had even got down to working out that you wanted to target Canary Wharf, which was the business district. Now, why I think your story is so important is you turned all of that around. So let's go back right to the beginning, because you were British born. And actually what was interesting to me is that your parents initially were not Islamic extremists. They were actually radicalized in the UK as well.
Absolutely, Dan. Thank you so much for having me on. Yes, it's been a long time since we've been trying to sort this out, and I'm very glad that we've got the opportunity now. As for my story, yes, you're absolutely correct. My parents, so I'll kind of start from the beginning. My
Please.
dad came here when he was 3 years old. So essentially, he was pretty much born and raised here, in effect. My mother came here when she was 18 in order to get married to my dad. And in the first few years of my life, the first 6 or 7 years of my life, I had a pretty normal life. My parents taught me that to be a good Muslim means to be a good person, that you pray to God and you treat people well. But then things quite rapidly took a turn for the worse. And that was when the way in which it occurred was that there was a fellow resident family in the same tower block that we lived in. And they introduced them to a form of Islam known as Salafism or Wahhabism. For context, that's the form of Islam that was traditionally practiced in the Saudi Arabia region. And it's very literalist and very extreme. Most Muslims even consider it to be very extreme. And that's when we started to attend a mosque that had been set up by the then Grand Mufti, or the head religious figure of Saudi Arabia. And he'd funded the creation of the mosque there.
And this is in East London?
Yes, in East London. So I believe it was initially in Leighton, in Waltham Forest. And that's when things began to change. First, the kind of music wasn't allowed. Secondly, all the photos that I had of my childhood were destroyed because you weren't allowed to have recreations of faces, even
Wow.
if they were photographs. So I don't have any childhood photos. Um, my parents' attire started to change. So before I go into this, that I should point out that some of the things I'm going to mention are not problematic in and of themselves,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
when it's taken as a whole together, it paints a picture. So my parents' attire began to change. My dad started to grow a progressively longer beard. My mother started to first wear she only used to wear the headscarf quite loosely before, but then she started wearing the hijab, which covers the whole body, but the face is visible. And then she started wearing the niqab, which has the face covered, but only the eyes visible. And then she even covered her eyes. But then after that, she went back to just wearing the niqab. And along with these changes came more problematic and insidious problems because I started then being exposed to these very extreme ideas on the part of my parents. So I was taught that, yes, the United Kingdom, you're living in enemy territory. Britain is the enemy of Muslims. America is the enemy of Muslims. There is a never ending war between Muslims and non Muslims. And one day we are all going to rise up and fight jihad, violent jihad, against the non Muslims, the kuffar, the infidels. And there was a lot of other stuff as well, but I think you get the idea. Um,
And you were eight
and
years old when the 9/11 attacks took place, and that was celebrated in your London community?
unfortunately, yes, and unfortunately, my family did celebrate it. That I feel deeply ashamed to even have to say that.
You were eight.
But
You were eight. So what
yeah,
do you remember from that day?
I remember my mother saying, "See, the non-Muslims have been killing us. Now we're killing them." And they were celebrating, and I think they gave out sweets, if I remember correctly. And I remember them saying that they deserved it, and there was no kind of empathy. It was very much just dehumanization of the other.
It's astonishing, isn't it, that that was going on in London in 2001. But of course, I guess you could argue that the war on terror that followed, and specifically the conflict in Iraq, which we remember divided the UK, would have been a propaganda boon. And I presume your parents' extremism increased over that period?
Yes, it absolutely did, as did mine. So when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars occurred, when they took place, those foreign policy decisions were made, and we actually did go into Afghanistan and Iraq. All the mosques that I was attending, all of them being Salafist, Wahhabi mosques, all of them, the imams there and the preachers there were all saying, see, the never ending war against Muslims and non Muslims, it's happening now. They're only in those countries merely to kill Muslims, to destroy Islam. Now, I don't know what you think about those foreign policy decisions, but the very idea, the supposition that somehow the West went into Iraq and Afghanistan merely to destroy Islam and just for the mere pleasure of killing Muslims, that's absolutely absurd. To me, that's absurd now. But back then, given the kind of the milieu in which I was living, all of the ideological stuff I'd been exposed to, it all kind of fit the narrative. And therefore I believed that. And unfortunately, as a consequence, my parents became very angry, as did I. And it was in my teenage years, kind of growing up, that led me to become even more radical, which then led on to my considering engaging in violence. Now, before I get to that, I do want to go back a little. And when I was around 8, 7, my parents told me never to have non-Muslim friends. They said that non-Muslims do not like Muslims and they really hate you, but they're just pretending to like you. Yet I had non-Muslim friends, and I knew for a fact that they did like me for who I was, that they genuinely were my friends. So that created a problem for me. It led to cognitive dissonance. Because on the one hand, I believed one thing, but on the other, I acted according to another thing. There was a contradiction there. And I feel that with many extremists, especially Islamists, this cognitive dissonance, when there's a contradiction between what you've been taught and what you believe and the actual reality, and there are a lot of contradictions because the ideology is pretty much insane. So when that contradiction occurs, it can lead to further retrenchment and further radicalization as like a defense mechanism, which is why I think that many Muslims in Britain, the extremist kind, refuse to integrate because, in fact, they're kind of looking further inwards and they're further becoming entrenched in their belief system. And after that, around when 9/11 happened, when I was around 8, I
Mm.
also figured out that I was gay. So
Whilst
I
you knew
was
when
an
you were 8.
yes. So I was an extremist, pretty much a jihadist by belief as a child, but also at the same time I was gay. And I remember precisely that day when I heard in the mosque what the punishment for homosexuality was in my form of Islam.
What were you told?
And I was told if anyone is gay, you throw them off from the highest place, be it a mountain or a roof. You either stone them to death or you throw them off the roof and then stone them to death just to ensure that the job's done. And
You
I
must have been
remember
terrified and tortured at that point.
utterly, utterly, absolutely terrified. I remember a chill going down my spine and thinking, oh my God, my life's in danger. Like, I mean, my parents wouldn't kill me here, but they could take me to Pakistan and then, right? And I was, from that day forward, until I pretty much de radicalized and accepted myself as gay, I lived my life in abject fear. And I really do mean that, in abject fear. Fear of being found out, fear of being harmed, fear of being excluded, fear of being kind of dismissed from the community. And I began to hate myself. I thought I was morally and actually disgusting as an individual.
Mm.
I had a lot of self hate. And I externalized that self hatred outwards onto others, i.e., the outgroup, the non Muslims. And the Islamic literature, when I was reading it, I was looking for solutions to this affliction that I thought I had. And they all said, become more religious, become more devout. Now, given that the form of Islam that I believed in and followed was already extreme, becoming more religious and devout meant becoming more extreme. So, in a bizarre twist of turn, I became further radicalized as a result, as an
I
indirect
understand.
consequence of me being gay.
I understand. So then there's another seminal moment in terms of Islamic extremism in the UK on the 7th of July 2005. So by that point, you would have been 12 years old. 3 of the suicide bombers, Sohail, were British born, like you. Do you remember your reaction to 7/7 and how it was greeted within the extreme community?
See, with 7/7, I remember it was break time in school. And when the breaking news came out, the teacher opened the classroom door to let the students in to watch the news. And I remember standing in front of the TV, kind of frozen, almost dumbfounded, because on the one hand, I was taught to believe that this was right, like that terrorism, that was literally the thing you're supposed to do.
But first, we've partnered with Gundry MD to share this information with you. Would you believe me if I told you inside your pantry right now is one of the healthiest foods on the planet? Yes, it's true, and it's not some weird, trendy superfood. Spoiler alert, it's olive oil. You've probably used to cooking with it, but there are countless ways to use olive oil to help yourself look and feel younger. For example, olive oil is a natural way to help you achieve a more youthful appearance. Besides helping you look younger on the outside, it's a fantastic tool for your insides as well. According to Dr. Stephen Gundry, a famous cardiothoracic surgeon, nutrition expert, and health advocate, you should get as much high-quality olive oil into your daily routine as possible, whether it's taking a shot of it daily or keeping a bottle of it in your bathroom medicine cabinet. But what kind of olive oil is best for your health? Well, any olive oil can give you some benefits, but if you're looking to get the best results, it matters a lot which one you pick. The olive oil industry is huge, you see. You can tell by the number of olive oil brands you can see at the grocery store, and you can bet they're not all made with the consumer in mind. And many brands may even cut corners one way or another to increase profits. When Dr. Gundry came to that realization, he was appalled. But some olive oils are so powerful, it may only take a few tablespoons a week to see these incredible health benefits. So how can you tell between an olive oil that can be a health booster and which one isn't up to par? Well, in an effort to answer that question, Dr. Gundry has decided to take a stand and release his personal research and findings. This video has gone viral since its release, and it's important you see it so you can start benefiting immediately. So you can watch the video right now by going to getolive1.com/outspoken, or you can just click on the link in the description box below. So that's getolive1.com/outspoken, or you can just click in the description box below on the link. People who have taken his advice have shared their results with him, saying the olive oil they bought after learning his simple rules have helped change their lives. So make sure you go to getolive1.com/outspoken or click on the link in the description box below this video. But now, back to the show.
Yet, at the same time, this was close to home. This was in London. This was the British public. What if any of my non-Muslim friends had been caught up in that? What if any of my Muslim friends had been caught up in that? What if, any member of public that I'd walked past when I was on my way to school had been caught up in that? And I genuinely felt, oh my God, this is wrong. But at the same time, again, I pushed it back to the darkest, deepest recesses of my mind because it contradicted everything I'd been taught. That's how powerful the brainwashing was, essentially.
But that is interesting to me, though, because I think it does show some development between 8 years old and 12 years old, and you're starting to realize, actually, maybe this isn't right. Can I just ask about your school? I mean, were you in an Islamic school? Was this type of propaganda taught at school, or was it all outside school in special mosque-run classes?
So it was pretty much outside of school. So I went to a secular school. And it turned out that actually about 80% of the school was of a Muslim background, whereas like 10% was of Afro-Caribbean descent, and the other 10% was other. And that
so the
included
radicalization took place within mosques?
Within mosques and at home.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's obviously a massive concern, but it does make sense. So at what age did you decide that actually you wanted to become a jihadist? You wanted to potentially kill people and be part of a terror attack in London?
every time I discuss this, I feel it's difficult. I've mentioned this multiple times. I go up and down the country talking to lots of people, sharing my story, doing de-radicalization work. And every single time, it just never gets easier.
No, I can imagine.
I began considering these thoughts when I was around 17.
Okay.
I was in sixth form college at that time. And interestingly, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were in their drawdown stages. Yet, I guess having the newfound freedom of going to college and remembering all the kind of anger that my parents showed and seeing my mom cry as the images were beamed in everyone's homes of the civilian casualties. And I became very angry. At the same time, to give some context, when I was in school, secondary school, I was pretty much the only extremist there. There were maybe one or two others. But when I went to college, all my friends were extremists. So this had occurred during a wave of Salafization where Salafism grew in London and in the wider UK. And given that I was surrounded by other extremists, this kind of led me down the path of wanting to do something like that. Now, on a kind of hypothetical level, I wanted to, but on an emotional level, I absolutely did not. Because as soon as I seriously began considering it, something inside me told me this is wrong. And I immediately thought back to 7/7 and my reaction to that. So I'm incredibly grateful that this happened, but my internal moral compass, thankfully, was strong enough to override all of that brainwashing, all of that indoctrination.
When you were considering doing it, were you envisaging a suicide attack? An attack where you would be killed?
Unfortunately, yes. I wanted to, not in that I would be killed, but I expected myself to die anyway.
And
The plan was to
Sorry, you go.
the plan was to build an IED and remotely detonate it.
But you assumed that you would be killed by the authorities?
Yes.
Okay. And what were you taught at the time in these extreme Islam teachings? What were you taught about what happened to the perpetrators of terror? Is it true, the stories that we hear about the virgins?
Unfortunately, among the sector of, there's a wide variety of different types of extremists. Some support terrorism, some don't. Among those that support terrorism, they believe that if you die during the act of committing an act of terror, you die a martyr. It's called shaheed. And essentially, they believe that you go straight to heaven if you ever die as a martyr. All of your sins get wiped, and it's just a one-way ticket to heaven. And some of the beliefs do include like 72 virgins and strange things like that.
Were you taught that?
I was. And it turns out that as a child, and I only realized that this was bizarre when I mentioned this to a friend, and he kind of reacted very negatively. As a child, I wanted to die a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
As a 7-8-year-old, I wanted to die a martyr in war, in holy war. That's
Wow.
the level to which I had been indoctrinated.
That's what I was just thinking. I mean, it's extraordinary. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.